I've put my Amazon to the side and I've rerolled to Deadeye, which in my eyes is the best ascendancy this season. With Glacial Lance we can one-shot map bosses, citadel bosses and even Pinnacle bosses with ease, and then we also have the classic lightning spear incorporated into the build, so our clear speed is unparalleled. Yes, this Deadeye variant is faster, stronger and survives far better than Amazon, and if you're worried about rerolling your character, don't worry. You can literally use most of your gear from Amazon straight over and start where you left off. So let me start off by explaining why Deadeye is ridiculously strong for spear skills. Spear skills such as Lightning Spear use frenzy charges to power themselves up. With Deadeye we have the Thrilling Chase Ascendancy node, which means our skills get double the benefit of consuming frenzy charges. So our Lightning Spear is super juiced up and our Glacial Lance is very powerful as well. We also get Tailwind incorporated into the build, which is one of the strongest buffs in the game. For just using any skill we get 1% movement speed and 15% increased evasion, and this can stack up to 10 times, so an extra 150% increased evasion rating and 10% movement speed, which makes mapping so fast. You can also use the Wind Ward Ascendancy node to get an extra 30% damage reduction on top. So Deadeye ends up being faster, stronger, and tankier for the exact same setup to Amazon. So let's go over my skill gems. I'll go over how we set up the one-shot Glacial Lance a little later. So we're using an Omen Scepter within the build, which gives us more spirit, and we also get the Malice buff, which applies critical weakness to enemies. This increases our critical hit chance against enemies nearby. Very useful because the Glacial Lance setup I'm running requires us to be near the bosses anyways to maximize damage. On our Spear Stab we run Rage, which gives us a stacking multiplicative damage bonus. I'll explain why Spear Stab is used a little later. Then for a Lightning Spear, remember to quality this gem first to 20% so you can create more bolts on impact. The most important support gem for Lightning Spear is Volt, which just creates so many more projectiles when throwing a Lightning Spear after running around. Long Shot, which makes Lightning Spear more deadly at further range. Innovate, which is a 35% damage buff. Fork, which makes it chain more, and Lightning Infusion for a further 25% damage. We then have Cast on Crit, which you want to keep as low level as possible, which is level 14, to lower that intellect requirement. Again, you want to quality this as quickly as possible because it reduces the spirit requirement by 10 if you get it to 20%, which is going to help spirit requirements a lot. Here we put Sniper's Mark, which every time we crit will apply Sniper's Mark to bosses, and then the next crit will activate Sniper's Mark to give us a frenzy charge. Remember, with the Deadeye Ascendancy node Avidity, there's a 30% chance to get 7 frenzy charges instead of 1. We also have Ingenuity for a lower cooldown, Impetus for more energy generation, and Profusion, so sometimes we generate 2 charges instead of 1 on bosses. We do not need Profusion on Combat Frenzy for mapping, trust me. We then have Herald of Thunder, which we have Electrocute and Neural Overload to generate frenzy charges using Combat Frenzy, and Ambush to increase its damage against full health enemies. Barrage we primarily use for our Glacial Lance, which thanks to the Deadeye Ascendancy node means we can get 16 charges of it active when we have 7 frenzy charges, which is nuts, so that we fire out 16 extra Glacial Lances with one throw. Here I have Premeditation for more damage, Murderous Intent so it can cull enemies, Twofold so we have a chance to double the effect of consuming those frenzy charges, and Perpetual Charge so there's a 35% chance to not use any frenzy charges when we use Barrage, which is handy in the setup for the one-shot Glacial Lance. We have Orb of Storms, which we primarily use for 2 reasons when bossing. The first is to apply Blind to those bosses, and the second is to build Rage stacks with Font of Rage. Rage is a massive damage boost. As you can see, we can build up stacks of Rage. Our damage goes up multiplicatively for Glacial Lance. We also have Inevitable Critical so that it can apply critical itself and apply Sniper's Mark through Cast on Crit, and Font of Blood for some healing when bossing. For Glacial Lance, we have Overextend for more damage, Blindside for more damage against blinded enemies, Deliberation for more damage, Primal Armament for more damage, and then Ambrosia. Ambrosia is a high risk, high reward strategy for bosses because it burns our mana flask for an extra 72% damage. What this does is that it will consume 20% of your mana charges per cast of Glacial Lance. What you want is a mana flask with a minimum of 122 charges. This means it will consume 24 charges per cast of Glacial Lance and give you an extra 72% damage. Obviously we are going for the 1-hit KO or the 2-hit KO against bosses, so we don't care too much about our mana flask being lost. But if you're low level or under geared, then you probably don't want to run Ambrosia. For our buffs, we want to use Wind Dancer, which will give us more evasion. Here I use Culling Strike and Pin. We have Combat Frenzy, which generates frenzy charges whenever we electrocute an enemy through Herald of Thunder, or we freeze enemies through Glacial Lance, which will happen from time to time on bosses. Remember, with a Deadeye Ascendancy node, Avidity, there's a 30% chance to get 7 Frenzy Charges instead of 1, so when mapping, I'm literally always running around with maximum stacks of Frenzy Charges. Here I've placed my Spirit buffs for Vitality, which will give us some more passive health healing, especially good on bosses, Cannibalism, which will sort out your healing health whilst mapping, and then I have Herbalism, so our health flask gives us more energy shield because we're running Eternal Youth. Our final gem depends on whether we're bossing or mapping. If we're bossing, we run Trinity. This gives us 13% more elemental damage on top. We add Fire, Cold, and Lightning Mastery here because the higher level for Trinity that we have, the more damage it gives. If you're running Trinity for bosses, then you want to turn off Herald of Thunder. This means we need 300 Spirit to run this build. You can also turn off Combat Frenzy if you're a bit low on Spirit to make it work at 270 Spirit. For mapping, we want to take off Trinity and run Ghost Dance instead, which gives us energy shield equal to 5% evasion when we get hit. We have 6,590 evasion in the build currently, but with 10 stacks of Tailwind, this shoots up to 13,491 evasion. So 5% of this is well over 650 energy shield you gain back per hit. It makes you really tanky. So if you want to run Ghost Dance with Herald of Thunder, Combat Frenzy, then you will need 260 Spirit for this to work when mapping. So between your Omen Scepter and your other gear, you need an extra 170 Spirit to reach 270 Spirit to make this build work. So let's get to bossing. How do we one-shot those bosses with Glacial Lance? Well, the setup requires you to do a few things. First, you want to place down Orb of Storms, which applies blind and builds rage stacks. Next, you want the maximum number of Frenzy Charges. Sometimes if you're mapping or you're doing Jest, then you may already have 7 charges, but if you don't, then you want to use Spear Stab a few times on your boss. Remember, with the Deadeye node Avidity and Frenetic, you have a 35% chance for this to instantly generate max stacks of Frenzy Charges, so it shouldn't take more than a few hits for you to generate max stacks. Then you want to use Barrage. This will get you 16 charges of Barrage up. Next, before you use Glacial Lance, you want to make sure you have at least 1 Frenzy Charge. Sometimes with Perpetual Charge on Barrage, you'll get those 7 charges transferred over for free. But if you don't, then Spear Stab once or twice more for 1 single charge, and then fire off your Glacial Lance up close to the boss. The reason we fire it up close is because of the node Point Blank, so we deal 20% more damage to enemies within 3.5 meters of the projectile. This all sounds a little bit complicated, but honestly, once you do this a few times, it's really easy. Stab, get maximum charges, Barrage, stab again, and then use your Glacial Lance. It's as easy as that. Next, let's go over our gear. For your weapon, you need Tangle Tongue, the legendary spear. As you already know, this thing is incredible. It lets you do double critical hits, especially for non-Amazon classes where we don't have the Ascendancy node, which boosts damage and crit chance based on accuracy. I've tried a lot of Tangle Tongues for this setup: flat damage, critical damage bonus, or 2 sockets, and the best roll has 2 things. Number 1, you want as high a critical hit chance roll as possible. Remember, after a certain while, the price does go up exponentially, especially if this number has been volled to above 20%. But yeah, make sure it's at least 17, 18, 19+%. The next thing you want is a Tangle Tongue corrupted with flat lightning damage. This is better than 2 rune sockets, because the corruption, as you can see, can roll higher than a lightning rune. Flat damage for this build is better damage than critical damage bonus after testing. Our offhand is the Omen Scepter, which you want as high an increased spirit roll on as possible. I'd recommend at least 50%. The affixes which provide stats to allies don't work for yourself, so all of those are useless for the build. Instead, you then want to roll intellect in your Omen Scepter and maximum mana. If you're struggling with the strength or intellect attribute requirements in the build, then you can also look for reduced attribute requirements as a roll on your Omen Scepter. For your amulet, you want the legendary Beacon of Aziz, which lets our critical hits ignore elemental resistances. This is really powerful because we're using both lightning and cold damage in the build, so then we don't have to worry about those penetration nodes on our passive tree for both of those elements. Our rings and gloves are really important sources of damage for the build because they can roll with huge amounts of flat damage, which is needed to compensate for the lack of flat damage on Tangle Tongue. For your rings, you want lightning damage and physical damage at the very least, and if you can afford it, a 3rd damage roll of cold or fire is ideal. Then look for intelligence, rarity, and resistances. For your gloves, look for triple flat damage with some stats and resistances. Don't worry about the base of the gloves too much. If you get a good roll on pure evasion, hybrid ES evasion, or pure energy shield, it doesn't matter too much. For your helmet, we use a pure energy shield helmet. You want resistances and as high an energy shield rolled as possible, along with rarity. Again, if you're struggling with the intellect requirement, you can find a helmet with reduced attribute requirements as an affix. For your chest piece, look for an evasion and energy shield hybrid chest piece. This is because with Spectral Ward we gain even more ES from the evasion on our chest piece. Look for maximum life, intelligence, and the resistances you need to cap them. There is a chest piece with a 5% movement speed implicit, but that is more expensive. You can also use a pure energy shield chest piece, and for the expensive version setup, I have actually switched to this, but I'll talk about that in a second. For your belt, you want a belt with 3 charm slots, minimum 2. Here you want maximum life and the resistances you need, and you ideally want 30 plus strength as well, which will help you hit the strength requirement for your scepter. The belt is probably the best place to look for that extra strength. Then finally for your boots, you want an evasion ES hybrid set of boots or a pure energy shield boots. Look for as high a movement speed roll as possible, along with maximum life and resistances. Again, you can squeeze some rarity in here. For your flasks, the mandatory flask for the build is a mana flask with 122 charges minimum for ambrosia damage scaling. Then look for a life flask with charges per second. For charms, the 2 mandatory charms in this build are Staunching Charm, so you don't need the legendary version. The regular version works as well, which will make you immune to bleeding. Bleed bypasses our energy shield and can drain our health really fast, so you need to stop this. The Stone Charm is equally mandatory. It stops you from getting stun locked and dying. The third charm you can either use is a Thawing Charm to prevent freeze, or an Antidote Charm to prevent poison damage. I also sometimes use a Golden Charm for more rarity in the build. You've probably noticed in my inventory I have a Sacred Flame Shrine Scepter. The footage you saw at the start of the video did not use this, so don't worry about needing this. This thing gives you nearly 60% more damage straight up and is super powerful for endgame builds. If you have this, then it will boost your damage significantly and let you one-shot even tier 4 Pinnacle bosses. The Scepter also provides the buff Purity of Fire. This will give you 40% fire resistance for free, so now I have well over 75% fire resist, and I can actually drop fire resistance from my gear. I'm actually in the process of replacing my rings for more chaos resistance, and I'll probably try to do the same on a few of my other pieces as well. Also, the Purity of Fire buff is bugged in a good way at the moment. We can place our spirit support gems here, things like Vitality and Cannibalism, and they will work and not use any spirit, which is really good. Because this thing has less spirit than an Omen Scepter, you will need to turn off both Herald of Thunder and Combat Frenzy when bossing to accommodate Trinity. For my endgame setup, I've also started using a pure energy shield robe. This does have a huge intellect requirement, so I don't recommend switching to this before endgame when you have good gear with lots of stats. But if I'm running a hybrid evasion ES chest piece with 10 stacks of tailwind, I have 82% evasion, which is probably a little bit of overkill. However, if I put on this pure energy shield chest piece, that evasion drops to 72%, which is still pretty good, but I now have 3.3k energy shield instead of 2.4k, which lets me tank so many more powerful hits in maps and bosses. I found this to be an absolute game changer for endgame mapping and bossing. I will put both variants up on Mobalytic so you can choose which setup to run depending on your budget. Let's move on to the passive skill tree. You want Avidity, which will sometimes give you maximum charges of frenzy charges instantly, which is mandatory for bossing when setting up that one-shot Glacial Lance. Thrilling Chase, which is what makes Deadeye so much more powerful than most other classes for using frenzy charge reliant skills such as spear skills. Then I also run Point Blank, which gives us 20% more damage against enemies close up. I also have Gathering Winds, which gives us Tailwind on skill use, which is a massive buff to movement speed and evasion. If you are struggling with survivability, when mapping especially, then I would recommend taking off Point Blank and putting it into Wind Ward, which will give you a further 30% damage reduction when you have 10 stacks of Tailwind. When you have good gear, this isn't necessary, so you can keep the same passive tree for both mapping and bossing, which is really nice. For the rest of our passive tree, the big changes from the Amazon skill tree is that we take these frenzy charge nodes here, which let us get up to 7 frenzy charges. Apart from that, the skill tree is pretty similar. We have those critical hit nodes, we have those spear damage nodes, and then we have energy shield evasion nodes which we pick up. Subterfuge Mask gives us more evasion for our pure ES helmet, and then Spectral Ward gives us more maximum energy shield from our evasion on our hybrid chest piece. Remember, if you're running pure energy shield, you can take this point out and put it into another damage node like a crit node. Remember, the Keystone Eternal Youth will let us heal our energy shield by using our potion. Because I'm slightly low level on this character, I haven't maxed out the tree, but one other node I will be getting is Stand and Deliver, which will synergize with Point Blank and give us even more damage when we use Glacial Lance and bosses up close. You can take this whole ideology of being up close to bosses and maximizing our damage even further with these low life nodes here, and the Deepest Tower unique helmet, which makes any enemies close to us behave as if they're on low life. I found this to make the build very glass cannon. It's great for one-shotting bosses, even tier 4 bosses, even when you're carrying multiple people, but it did make it so hard for mapping, so I did have to switch gear back and forth, which was a little bit annoying. But that is a setup you can keep in the back of your mind in case you want to maximize that damage even more. So there you have it, my endgame Glacial Lance Lightning Spear Deadeye build that can absolutely decimate maps in record time and one-shot Pinnacle bosses. If you enjoyed what I talked about today, remember to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel as I keep updating this build in Dawn of the Hunt. I'm Mr. Ronnet, and that's it for today. Peace out, guys.